Hello everyone out there in YouTube land, and welcome to a new edition of The Written Page, the podcast that is related to the column that I write, and I have been writing for quite a while, for La Página Escrita, the journal from the Jordi Sierra y Fabra Foundation out of Barcelona, Spain. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I am talking to you from the town of Martin in northwest Tennessee. And today we have a very interesting show, a very special interview with a writer who just published a new novel, and whose previous novel, Wolf Hollow, was a Newbery Medal Honor Book from 2017. Her new novel is called Beyond the Bright Sea, and she's joining us through FaceTime today, and I really appreciate her time. Her name is Lauren Wolk. Hello, Lauren, and thank you for being a part of the podcast today.
Hi, Anton. I'm very, very happy to be with you.
Well, we really appreciate it because the book that I have in my hand right now is Wolf Hollow, published by Dutton in 2016. It was a Newbery Medal Honor Book, as I just said a few seconds ago, and it's a book that I read, and I was instantly thrilled by the book, really interested in the story, really interested in the characters. It's a book that's really well written, and it really keeps you at the edge of your seat a lot of the time. Not necessarily because there's a ton of action in the book, but because of how well the characters are depicted, and the story is absolutely fantastic from my point of view. So first of all, congratulations for the book, and congratulations also for the Newbery Medal honor.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to write it, and it was a wonderful pleasure to receive that honor.
Well, the first question that I would have for you, Lauren, is could you tell us a little bit about where you were born and what you remember about your childhood, which is important when it comes to this book, Wolf Hollow?
Sure, absolutely. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1959, and I've lived in quite a few places, many of them while I was still a child. And most importantly, I spent a lot of time on the family farm in western Pennsylvania where my mother grew up. And her stories of her childhood there and my own experiences as a child on that farm really inspired me to write the book. It was very, in some ways, very much a blend of fact and fiction. Things that happened to me or her worked their way into the book. But then, of course, I created fictitious characters and I made them do things, or they led me to write about what they were doing that were entirely imagined. But it was really very much inspired by that part of my childhood, time on that farm. And I'm lucky to have a very long memory about what it's like to be a child. So it made it relatively easy for me to step into the skin of the main character, Annabelle, and imagine what her life was like.
I remember myself as a child. I was quite an avid reader, and I would read, anything I could find, from Roald Dahl to, the Brothers Grimm to, some of the Central and North European writers of children's and young adults literature from 1960s, 1970s, people like Astrid Lindgren, for example. And I remember that those days with, I have really fond memories of those days. As a child, were you an avid reader too, Lauren?
I was. We have a strong tradition in my family of reading to one another. So just as my mother's mother read to her and my mother's grandmother read to her when she was a child, so did she read to me and my siblings when we were little. And then as soon as we were able to read on our own, we did, and have ever since. We're a very, very literary family. Everybody reads a lot, and we all share what we've read with each other at family gatherings. So most of us in my family really lead a life of the mind, and literature is a strong component of that.
What books do you remember reading as a child? Are there any writers that made an impression on you back then, or not really?
Oh, sure. No, I remember actually hundreds of them. And when people ask me what my favorites were, it's very difficult to answer because so many of them, all of them really were favorites. The ones I remember anyway stayed with me because they were so important. So when my mother or father were the ones reading to me, it was books like Goodnight Moon and all of the Beatrix Potter books. And as I was older, I started reading books like Laura Ingalls Wilder books and Island of the Blue Dolphins and My Father's Dragon and all. I just, it's an endless list, all of them wonderful. And in some ways, I wish I could return to childhood and start over again, because the books I read then just have stayed with me my whole life, and they really have helped to make me a writer. So I miss them. I actually miss being the child who heard them or read them for the first time.
I can kind of relate to that. You seem to have had a literary childhood and youth where books were important to you. And because of my father, who was a high school teacher and also a writer himself, I had the chance to have access to lots of books from the time I was born and from the time I was able to read. I was able to just go and grab the books off the shelf and read them. So that kind of resonates with me. But from being a reader like that all your life, when and how or why did you decide to become a writer?
Kids ask me that all the time. I just met with 600 of them yesterday and 400 the day before. And somebody always says, actually a bunch of them always ask me the same question. When did you know you were a writer? When did you start writing? And my answer is always that I became a writer the day I was born, because I think we are born with certain things in our DNA, in who we are from the very first moment, that lead us to become what we are as adults, as long as it's nurtured. So I really think I became a writer when I was born. But did I start practicing writing at that moment? No, but I did start to accumulate all the experiences that have informed my writing and who I am as a human being. So I would say I've been a writer for 58 years, but I actually took up pen to paper as soon as I was able to. My mother tells me stories about how when I was very young, I would write poetry without really realizing that's what I was doing. It's just the way I like to communicate with the world. And I think being an artist means, any kind of artist means being very observant. And so when you see things in everyday life that strike you as interesting or evocative, you want to share that with other people. And the way I shared my impressions was through writing. So I can't remember a time when I was not writing.
And at first you wrote quite a bit of poetry.
Yes, and I still do.
And Wolf Hollow, is this your first novel for young adults? Is that right?
Yes, and I didn't know it was for young adults. I thought I was writing for an adult audience because I had one book for adults before that, and I wasn't paying much attention to who I was writing for. I was just writing. But my agent read it and said, oh, well, it has a wonderful young protagonist, and it seems very suitable for young readers, and we think that's who it should be for. And I was actually really surprised, because I just hadn't thought of it like that, but I was thrilled, of course, and I continue to be thrilled with the idea and the fact that I'm writing for young readers. I get to spend time with thousands of young readers who are interesting and wise beyond their years, and smart and funny and wonderful in all ways. So this is a new chapter of my life, and as a writer and a person, and I'm loving every minute of it.
Well, now that you've turned over a new page, and as you say, you've begun writing a new chapter of your life, in what ways is it different to write for young adults and to write for adults?
For me, it's not really very different. In fact, when I wrote Wolf Hollow, and my agent told me that it was really meant for a young audience, my first concern was that she find an editor for me who would not make me change the book in any radical way, not dumb it down, not make it too simple, not make it too sweet. And fortunately, I have an editor who didn't attempt any such thing. She knew it was a book that was meant for really just pretty much all readers, and certainly for kids. And she didn't ask me to alter things, and I'm grateful to her for that. And the same thing goes for Beyond the Bright Sea. I do find, as I'm writing now and I'm more aware of audience, that I have to be very, very careful not to let external things intrude on the process, because I've always been a very focused writer who is mostly, almost entirely concerned with putting the right words in the right order. And so now that, I've achieved a measure of success and have a very definite audience, I have to watch that very carefully and make sure that I don't get what I call monkey mind, where I'm thinking too much about the things that come after the book is done. So, audience, I just want to write for a reader who wants layered characters, complex characters, and a story to which they can resonate, something they can identify with, something they can learn from.
And since you were you still write poetry, and you began writing more poetry than novels or fiction, whether it be for adults or for young adults. How does writing poetry? How does your poetry affect your prose, if it does in any way?
It does. In fact, I wrote a poem about Wolf Hollow before I ever wrote the novel. Poetry, I've sometimes compared poetry to fiction in this way, that poetry is like pointing a finger at something very specific, and fiction is more like a fist. Poetry, it has to be so much more disciplined and precise. And by that, I don't mean that you have to be more cautious about what kind of words you use, just that you just have to rein yourself in and use only the words you absolutely need to use. Fiction, you can get a little lazier. You can experiment a little more with things and take a few more liberties, I believe. And so I find poetry much more difficult to write than fiction. But every time I do write a poem, it makes me exercise my literary muscle hard, and it's good for me. I think it's good for all writers to try and write poetry.
My father had a very good friend who was also a writer, and he hardly ever wrote poetry, but my father wrote quite a bit of poetry, and a couple of times they wrote books together, where my dad would write a poem, and then this other person would write just a story based on that poem. And this person who hardly ever wrote poetry always joked with my father, saying, "Well, you write a lot less than me, and you make the same amount of money." So that's another way to look at it, I guess.
That's a very cool idea, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and we have the pleasure today to chat with Lauren Wolk, who has just published a new novel called Beyond the Bright Sea. And she was awarded a Newbery Medal Honor for Wolf Hollow, which was her 2016 novel, her very first for young adults. Let's concentrate a little bit about on Wolf Hollow. How did the idea for Wolf Hollow develop? I've heard it is partly based, like you said before, on farm stories that your mother used to tell you about her childhood in rural Pennsylvania. But how did the idea for the novel develop?
Well, I actually never know what's going to develop in a novel, or a poem for that matter. When I begin, I start with a sense of place, and I make sure I create a setting where I want to spend time and where I hope to be able to transport my readers to. And then I put in at least one person, usually a couple, and I have a glimmer of an idea of what their interaction is going to be, what their conflict might be, internal, external. But I really don't know what's going to happen, and I don't want to know, because I find it much more enjoyable for me as a writer to create characters I trust enough to follow. So I create Annabelle, who's the main character in Wolf Hollow, and then her friend Toby, and a terrible character named Betty, and I pretty much just put them down in the middle of these hills in Pennsylvania and see what happens. I once tried to write a book that I mapped out from the beginning, and it was very tedious to write. I think it was very tedious to read, and it's sitting on a shelf in my closet. It will never, ever see the light of day. It just didn't feel good. It wasn't fun, whereas writing Wolf Hollow made me cry, made me laugh, surprised me in all kinds of ways, and was an adventure. So if my readers have that adventure too, that's wonderful. I try really hard not to think ahead. I just let it come out as it comes.
I take it Wolf Hollow is a real place.
It is. It's a very small, little, tiny valley on the edge of the family farm, which is still our family farm. And it was named, this is one of those strands of fact that I weave in with fiction. It was named because when my grandfather was a boy, they used to dig pits in this little valley at the edge of the woods and trap wolves in them and shoot them, because the county thought there were too many wolves around, so they offered a $3 bounty for a pair of wolf ears. And my grandfather told me this story and said that's why this little valley was named Wolf Hollow. So when I was writing the book, I had the main character, Annabelle, go and ask her grandfather how Wolf Hollow got its name. And of course, I had her hear the same story I heard from my grandfather. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's a real place, very much so. My uncle lives there in a log cabin. You'd never find it on a map, I don't think, but it is a real place.
Are the characters of Annabelle, Betty, and Toby, for example, based on real people in any way, or did you just invent these characters by did you throw them together with different features from people you knew? How did you go about creating those characters?
Annabelle just sort of came to me as a girl I would have loved to have known, or loved to have been. She's a mixture of me, my mother, my grandmother, and just total fiction. Toby was inspired partly by stories my mother used to tell of drifters who had come through the hills around the farm, refugees from World War I or from the Great Depression, looking for something to eat, a place to sleep, some work to do. And one of them stayed in the area and eventually ended up being taken away and put in an asylum because he had been so mentally damaged in World War I. She would tell me these stories about people like that, and I was inspired to create a character sort of somewhat reminiscent of the real drifters who came through there, although also entirely fictional in so many ways. And as for Betty the bully, I've known bullies in my life. I know what it feels like to feel small and powerless. I actually feel that way all the time right now, as a matter of fact. And unfortunately, bullying is far too prevalent. Always has been. I hope it won't always be. But Betty was just sort of like the quintessential bully we often have in our lives, but also a symbol of what was going on in the world in World War II, that these bullies in Europe and elsewhere were victimizing innocent people in a totally irrational and evil way. So I wanted somebody like that in the mix as well.
Now, as you mentioned, you decided to set the novel in World War II America, rural America for that matter. And is there anything special about that time period that interests you in a personal way?
It does, actually, and I think it interests a lot of us. There's so many books, especially now, about World War II, and I think it's because I am at least, baffled by how evil rises in people and how so few of these truly evil monsters in the world manage to wreak such havoc and to engage so many thousands and millions of others who are not essentially evil, but who allow the worst in themselves to rise when given that sort of opportunity. We're seeing it all the time now, and I'm afraid we always have. So I look at World War II as a really good example of something really bad that I wish we could overcome. And I'm fascinated by the effects of good and bad influences on all of us. So in this book, you have a terrible girl who brings out the best in some people who manage to be brave enough to stand up to her, and the worst in others who decide to follow her. And it's a familiar story, but I think World War II still stands as perhaps, well, one of the greatest examples of true evil taking over otherwise ordinary people.
You definitely are tapping in this book into themes and topics and ideas that are still very prevalent today, and I think that's one of the reasons why, even though the book is set in World War II America, it's still very current in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, it is.
But when it comes to the narrative style of this book, of Wolf Hollow, I find the narrative style very direct, not flowery in the least, devoid of any unnecessary metaphors. I mean, of course, there are metaphors. There are different ways in which you tell the story. But was this a conscious effort on your part to try to write the book in as direct a manner as possible, or did it just come out that way?
Well, that's a really good question, because when I write poetry, and often before Wolf Hollow, when I wrote fiction, I tended to go a little too flowery, too lyrical, too self-indulgent as a writer. I love metaphors. I love similes, personification. I love figurative language. Truly do. However, when I sat down to write Wolf Hollow, it just came out in the first person. First time I'd ever written in the first person, and it came out in the voice of an almost 12-year-old girl. And so it came out the way it needed to come out, which was in a child's voice, a perceptive, wiser than her years, really, child, but still a child, who is not about to be speaking in similes and metaphors all the time, or thinking in them for that matter. And that's not to say that young people aren't creative, but I wanted it to be realistic in the sense that everything in the book is seen through her eyes and had to ring true. I think authenticity is really important in a book, and I was aiming for that. But mostly it was a sort of a subconscious effort. I simply slipped into her skin and became Annabelle every time I sat down to write. And that was the voice. That was her voice that came out onto the page.
One thing that I find interesting about the book, Lauren, is that we're talking about a girl, Annabelle, who is actually talking about this, telling this story, reminiscing about things that happened in the past. And I think, from my perspective as a reader, one of the great things about this book is this idea of memory. The idea that she is not writing it as it happens, but she's actually thinking about it from the present, thinking about the past. And of course, we know from memory, that memory, could sometimes fail you. It could be, you could be telling a totally different story than it actually happened. Did you think about anything like this as you were writing the book?
I really didn't, and you're absolutely right that she is telling this story as an adult, although I think probably a relatively young adult looking back on this episode in her childhood, and so that also contributes to the tone of it and the voice, that it is not Annabelle at 11 who's really telling it, but a slightly older version of herself, so that also contributed to how I wrote the book. But no, I'm not. I'd like to say that I sit down and plan this all out and it all's perfect and I know what I'm doing, but I really don't. I really just sort of, it's a very organic process. I just sit down and begin, and what comes, comes. And the book I'm working on right now, for instance, is shocking the hell out of me. I don't even know where half of it is coming from. And yes, process involves deliberate decisions. But those usually come to me during revision. I notice things happening, or, in the second half of the book, I'll notice something developing as I'm writing, and I'll think, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from. And I'll keep working, and I'll start to notice other things that are related to that first, a little epiphany. And then things do become a little more deliberate as I go along. I still don't know I don't want to know the plot as I go. I don't want to know how it ends. But I do start to develop an idea of how the different strands of the book weave together. And so some of it is relatively deliberate, but most of it is, it's just sort of like I get in a zone and things happen and then I go, when it's over.
You're listening to the voice of Lauren Wolk, who's joining us for a conversation about her book from 2016, Wolf Hollow, which is a Newbery Medal Honor Book for 2017. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and this is a new episode of The Written Page, which will be available on YouTube very, very soon now. One of the things that I was thinking about your novel, Lauren, is I just find the opening line of the novel extremely powerful. And the novel opens like this. It goes, "The year I turned 12, I learned how to lie." And it stops there. And then it goes on to say, "I don't mean the small fibs that children tell. I mean real lies fed by real fears. Things I said and did that took me out of the life I'd always known and put me down hard into a new one." Now, would you say that this opening encapsulates the novel's theme? Is this, as you start the novel, is this what the novel is going to be about?
Well, at the time that I began to write it, I thought so. And as it turned out, yes. It sort of is an apt beginning for what transpires later. But I was intrigued, as you seem to have been, by that first line, because I wasn't really sure what I meant by that until things unfolded. And sometimes I'll go back to the beginning of a book and change it because it no longer reflects what happens later. But in this case, it took me 3 months to write Wolf Hollow. It came out in huge bursts. If I had a day off, which didn't happen very often from my job, I'd spend 8 or 9 hours writing without taking much of a break because it was, I don't know, I must have been working on this book internally for a long time because it was just this huge, amazing gout of words that came out. And so The beginning, the middle, the end, they all seem to work pretty well together. Of course, I revised. Of course, I made some changes, and I have a wonderful editor who helped me see some things clearly. But this beginning really, because it was so strongly in Annabelle's voice, it really did, in the end, have a strong connection to everything that came after it.
I'm simply asking that because obviously the idea of lying, truth and lie, is a very important, running theme throughout the novel. And of course, we're talking about an 11-year-old, who's turning 12, who learns how to lie. And of course, when we're talking about kids that age, and maybe a little younger, or just around that time, it may be that the difference between truth and lie is not always too clear to them. I have a 4.5-year-old right now, and sometimes the difference between a lie and truth is clear in her mind. Sometimes it's not. When do you think we should start telling our kids about the difference between truth and lie? Because obviously she learns this difference when she's 12. Is this something that perhaps you think happens around that time often, and that's why you wrote about that, or is it just was that your experience personally, or?
Those are all good questions, and the whole concept of lying is a fascinating one to me because we all lie all the time. We lie to each other in innocent ways, little white lies that are meant really to smooth over the bumps in life, and I don't really see anything wrong with that. And bigger lies, I think, whether they're wrong or not, depend upon the reasons why we tell them. And we aren't always clear on that, and the kids aren't always clear on that. But I always tell kids to develop a strong sense of honesty with oneself. If you lie to yourself, that's probably the worst kind of lie there is. But if you're honest with yourself and you feel that it is really important to tell a lie to someone else in order to help them, in order to avoid a problem that's beyond your solving, or some other really good, and I mean good as in the sense of morally good reason, then maybe it's worth telling a lie. But I know people who are not honest with themselves, who believe their own lies. And I think that's a very dangerous business, no matter who you are, what age you are, or what station you hold in life. Though I have to say, the more powerful you are, the more dangerous it becomes to lie to yourself, because the influence you have over others is frankly undeserved, unearned, and wrong. So different kinds of lies, depending on the situation, deserve different kinds of consideration. I lie all the time. I mean, I do. I mean, my son says, do you like my hair? I say, yeah, do you? That's all that matters. Well, I hate his hair, but it's not my business. And so I think the reasons why we do things are incredibly important, and being honest with ourselves, that's really critical.
Well, I definitely do lie myself when I'm teaching my classes at the university. I teach Spanish, and you want to put on a mask sometimes when you're teaching the classes. You don't necessarily want to tell the students absolutely everything in a straight way. You want to leave a little mystery here about yourself as the teacher. So that they don't think they know you a little bit too well. And in doing that, you're definitely putting on a little bit of a lie too.
And I find a really excellent way not to lie to someone is to turn around and ask them the question themselves. They say, how do I look? My answer to them is, well, how do you think you look? You happy with how you look? They say yes. I say, then don't ask me. It's not important, which tells them something too. But big lies are tricky. I've had to tell a few big lies in my life. But it's a lie of omission, not telling something that I probably should tell. But I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. So I sometimes postpone the truth. That's probably a good way to put it. I postpone the truth.
And, of course, the idea of lying does connect the story in rural Pennsylvania with the whole bigger lie that was a much bigger overarching lie that was going on in World War II. And, I think that's another, very witty way of relating the story that you're telling with the time period in which you are setting the novel.
Well, thanks. It's interesting how the broader global setting I knew was there, and of course all the characters knew what was going on overseas, but it I did not see a lot of the connections between the macrocosm and the microcosm until fairly late in the book, and I was so excited when I saw the different layers of the book, the echoes I could hear in the book, and then, as I said before, to go back and develop them during revision. It's a wonderful process making art. It's like so much of it is a surprise, and so much of it is really inspires thought and introspection. And I can't recommend it highly enough. So many people say, and kids say, oh, I'm not an artist. I don't make art. And it blows my mind that they have already shut the door on that, because that creativity is self-exploration. And if you can get kids to consider themselves wells, deep wells, that they need to tap, they need to reach down in the darkness and pull out things about themselves that they might otherwise never discover. It's an active process being a creative person, and kids need to be active in that way.
I agree with that totally, and I try. I think in many ways that's the way I was raised as a child, and I'm very thankful for that. And I'm hoping to be able to impart that upon my daughter now that I'm a father myself. And you certainly see kids and life around kids in a very different way when you're talking about your own kids than when you're talking about some kids of other people, or some kids that may exist in the future. When it's real to you, when it's actually your daughter or your son, obviously you're going to feel differently about these ideas: truth, lie, good, bad, childhood, adulthood, right? I see that the novel is full of those dichotomies, that we're mentioning. Another dichotomy, I think, is Annabelle versus Betty. What is the relationship like between these two characters? Without giving too much away about the novel's plot, did you pit them against one another on purpose, or did it just happen again?
Well, I love dichotomies. I love foils. I love the interplay of light and dark, and hard and soft, and good and evil, and all the rest. These two sort of just appeared in my imagination, and I gave Betty a stick and plunked her down on a path, and had Annabelle meet up with her, and the rest just came. But I really find in most of the books I love that to read, I find that there is that essential conflict going on. Of course, in addition to internal conflicts, which are so fascinating as well. But, I try to avoid cliche, talking about light and dark and good and evil. There's nothing new about any of that. But to develop characters who bring some fresh perspective to that age-old battle is a challenge. And it was a great deal of, I don't want to say fun, but it was very, very satisfying to try and cast that in a new light. So Betty and Annabelle, flip sides of a coin. I do think Betty is a truly evil creature. And in that way, she is reflective of people like Hitler. In fact, she does have blonde hair and blue eyes. When the kids ask me, oh, why is Betty so evil? I ask them what she looks like. And they say, she has blonde hair and blue eyes. And I say, okay, what's going on over in Europe at the time? Well, World War II. And who's the biggest bully in World War II? Well, Hitler. And who did he think was the master race? And so we get into this conversation about symbolism and microcosm. And you should see their eyes. They start to look past what's right in front of them to what's beyond that first impression. And they're smart kids. I tell you, they're amazingly wise, smart, and perceptive. All you need to do is sometimes ask them a few questions.
And I think it's very important to do that, in that they're able to relate what they're reading about with the world around them, and they for the first time when they do that, they will be able to look at the world around them critically, and that's an important thing to learn from a very young age, because otherwise you'll get to your adult life and you will not have the practice to do that, and I think that's very dangerous.
I agree with you entirely. I think kids need to be taught how to think. They need to learn how to learn. They need to be independent learners, lifelong learners. They should not be spoon-fed. They should be inspired. Their intellectual curiosity will see them through amazing lives where they'll make great contributions. And if they're not intellectually curious and confident and excited about learning new things, they will live unproductive and uninspired and unsatisfying lives.
When talking about Betty, you have mentioned, Lauren, the word evil a couple of times during our conversation, and I was wondering if, you think that you maybe have endowed Betty with any possibility of redemption for her actions in this novel.
Any possibility for redemption for Betty?
Yes. I'm wondering if that's a possibility or not, because one reads the book and thinks, well, why is it that this character is lying? Why is she so evil in that way? Is there any possibility that this character, of course, characters exist in the book. We can't walk down the street and talk to Betty. There may be people like her, but not her. I understand that. But my question is, do you think this character has any possibility, any option for redemption when it comes to, her behavior, the behavior that she displays throughout the novel?
That's a good question. Kids ask that all the time. And one answer is I don't know, because I only know this novel, this world, through Annabelle's eyes. I know only what she knows. I don't know what Betty's motives are. I don't know what her backstory is. I can't explain her actions or why she seems to get such satisfaction out of hurting other people and of lying about other people. But I do know something about the world and people like Betty, and I think it's a very complicated situation when somebody gets pleasure out of inflicting pain on others. Sometimes it's sort of bred in the bones. Some of us are just sort of born with an inclination towards cruelty. But of course, there's also the nurture part of the nature-nurture equation. And so the experiences of a person, of course, contribute greatly to who they are and how they behave and how they think. It's complicated. I think often the people who are most cruel are the ones who have been most hurt and the ones who feel victimized and therefore want others to feel as they do, which is one way to look at things. Another way is some people who have been victimized and hurt and brutalized in their lives set out to make it their life's mission to be good and kind and to balance out the darkness they've known. And I don't know why one person chooses one path and one chooses another. I am eternally grateful that I think, one of those who tries hard to be good and to be kind and to be fair. Trying to do all those things is the important thing. But some people seem either incapable or disinclined to work toward, goodness.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and we're winding down now the conversation, very interesting conversation with Lauren Wolk, the author of Beyond the Bright Sea, her new novel published earlier this year, and Wolf Hollow from 2016 that received the Newbery Medal Honor in 2017. An absolutely recommendable book, Wolf Hollow, which has been published by Dutton. And you mentioned before that you had just talked to about 600 kids, so I suppose that you talk to your readers fairly often, whether it be in person or maybe through email. What has attracted the younger readers about Wolf Hollow so far, would you say?
Well, there are a number of things, and one of them that pleases me greatly is what I've heard from them. At least they come up to me and say, thank you for giving us a book that's serious and has big issues in it, has real, something for us to chew on and talk about and consider. There's a place for fantasy in this world, and I love books that make me laugh and take me on fantastic voyages. I did as a child, and I still do. But I believe that every good literary diet should have a measure of meat and potatoes to go along with the fudge. And some of the kids have come up to me and said, we just don't get enough books that really make us think. And this book really made us think. And I love to hear that, of course, because those are the books I loved when I was a child, especially. So I do hear a lot of that. I also hear from kids that they liked the suspense. They just wanted to find out what was going to happen. And I can identify because as I was writing, I really wanted to find out what was going to happen. It drew me along. So I hear that as well. Some kids and adults, and I should say a lot of adults have read this book and they think it's for them. And that's great because I think it's for both. They say they like the writing. they just like the way I use words. And I have to say, I like to hear that as well, because that's the way I make art. And so I appreciate that feedback from them. So there are lots of different reasons why kids seem to be liking this book and Beyond the Bright Sea. One girl in Wellesley said to me, I think this book proves that you respect kids. And she's right, I do. I respect them highly, highly. So if Wolf Hollow and Beyond the Bright Sea and my other future books convey that respect, I'm very glad of it.
I think only somebody that respects kids can write good literature for kids. And in fact, I've always thought, all my life really, and that's one of the reasons why I write this column for La Página Escrita over in Spain. I've always thought that good children's literature, good young adults literature, is simply literature that anyone can enjoy.
I agree with you entirely, and I very much appreciated when Dutton decided to put the age range for the book as 10 and up, because, and I would argue even, although I like that designation, I've heard from a lot of grandparents and parents who have read the book to somewhat younger kids, but I do think 10 is about a good age for readers who are reading this book independently. But I've met with hundreds of adults, 60, 70, 80, 90-year-old adults, who really enjoyed reading Wolf Hollow and Beyond the Bright Sea, partly because this is historical fiction, and it took them back to their own childhoods. And we've had wonderful conversations, lots of book clubs, lots of library groups. And yes, you're right. I get emails, I get all kinds of messages, and I get people walking in the door where I work. I work at the Cultural Center of Cape Cod in South Yarmouth, and pretty much every day I get people walking in to have a little conversation or get a book signed, and that personal contact is fantastic.
Well, some critics, for example, Jennifer Donnelly in the New York Times, have pointed out the possible influence of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Is that so? And if so, what other writers besides Harper Lee may have influenced your style when you sit down to write a novel like this?
I can say honestly that any influence from any other writer is something that's in the marrow of my bones by now. But of course, every book I've ever read has contributed to who I am as a writer. In fact, the more we read, the better we write. But as far as a sort of explicit influence or anything intentional, the first time I heard that comparison to Kill a Mockingbird, I literally fell out of my chair. I was stunned and I was horrified. I have to say I was absolutely horrified because, first of all, I had no intention, and I did not even see the parallels between the two books, in terms of plot or tone or anything else until someone pointed them out to me. And then I was truly horrified because the last thing I want to do is do something someone else has already done. Mm-hmm. On the other side, I was honored to be mentioned even in the same breath as that book or that author, because for me, To Kill a Mockingbird is an iconic and brilliant and beautiful and heartbreaking American novel. And just as an aside, I would like to say that the superintendent or principal in Mississippi who decided to take To Kill a Mockingbird out of the school curriculum because it is too controversial or makes people feel too uncomfortable really ought to have a little, really ought to rethink that. It's absolutely appalling. So, but back to your question, I've been influenced by a lot of authors in my life, including Scott Odell, who wrote Island of the Blue Dolphins, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, and E.B. White. Oh my God, E.B. White, just, if I could sit down with that man for 10 minutes and have a conversation, I'd do it in a heartbeat. There are way too many to mention, but as I said when I started to answer this question, and I think this is true for most writers, we would not want to replicate or even too closely echo something that's been done before. But we cannot help but be influenced by things we have experienced in our lives, including the art we've seen, the music we've heard, the books we've read, and everything else we've ever done. So it's impossible to extricate ourselves from influence. And I don't think we should try.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that thing about the principal in Mississippi, because I've always thought whenever we talk here at the university about banned books week and banned books and that sort of thing, Of course, this has happened throughout history, and it's still happening these days in the 21st century. Books are still banned, books are still taken off the curriculum, etc., etc. But the only reason why that could be is because these people are looking at literature from an ideological perspective, and of course, ideology is something that is usually very unhappy about certain things in literature, because ideology likes to question everything except for its own principles. And so if you read something that kind of is trying to, it's speaking against your beliefs, your ideas, your principles that you believe in, you're going to be right away opposed to it. But it has nothing to do with the book itself. It has more to do with the person. It tells us more about the person, I think, than it tells us about the book.
I would agree with you. I think people who are questioning the place of a book like To Kill a Mockingbird in a school curriculum are showing their own shallowness, their own cowardice, their own misunderstanding of the role of literature and art in our lives, and of education for that matter. These are people who should not be in any position to make decisions about the curriculum of the schools where we send our children.
And to finish our conversation, Lauren, your new novel. Let's talk very briefly about your new novel, which was published earlier this year. It's called Beyond the Bright Sea. Could you tell us just a little bit about it? Is it very different from Wolf Hollow, or does it share any similarities? It's on my reading list, of course. I want to read it as soon as I can. But I admit I haven't read it yet, so what would you say to somebody that has read Wolf Hollow but hasn't read Beyond the Bright Sea? What can we expect?
I would say that there are some similarities and there's some differences. The similarities are that it's historic fiction, takes place in the 1920s. It's rural, although the farm in this book is the Atlantic Ocean. It takes place on the fictitious island right off some real islands called the Elizabeth Islands, which are by Martha's Vineyard, near where I live, here on Cape Cod. It features as its protagonist basically 12-year-old girl named Crow, who is faced with questions about her identity, her origins, her place in the world. And so there are similarities between the two books. But it's very, very different as well. Wolf Hollow did have some internal conflict quite a lot, but it also, I think, primarily, or at least heavily, had an external conflict with other characters. In the case of Beyond the Bright Sea, you have plenty of external conflict and plot twists and turns and that sort of thing, but you really have a young girl who's trying to find out who she is in this world. And there's some of that in Annabelle, but there's a lot of that in this girl, Crow. And I love her. I love them both. People say to me, why do you keep writing about girls? And I say, well, I have sons, but I don't have daughters unless you count Annabelle and Crow, which I do. And the new girl I'm creating in my new book is named Ellie. I feel like I've got these strong, smart, courageous girls as my daughters, and I miss them terribly. Once a book is published and they sort of become a little more distant from my life, I really miss them in a really visceral way. So there are a lot of similarities between the two books, and there will be with this new book as well. I keep hearing echoes no matter what I do, but very different characters in some ways, very different plots, very, very different settings.
Is it easier for you to write about girls or women because you are a woman, or not?
I think probably that's true as well, because as I said earlier, I have a long memory and I know what it's like to be a girl. But as a mother of sons, I also know a lot about boys. And of course, I married one and lots of my friends are boys and I have a father. All those things, there have been men in my life, very strong influences, and I know them well. But yes, I think it's good advice to say that we should write about what we know best. And one of the things I know best is what it means to be a female. And so that may be it too. I also think the world needs, and this is not the reason I write about girls, but it's a happy coincidence that this world needs good literature about strong girls, period.
Well, I would agree with that. And did you document yourself a lot about World War II when you were writing Wolf Hollow, or did it just come out of the stories you used to hear?
Pretty much the latter. I didn't need to do much research. Of course, we all know so much about World War II, but about life in Pennsylvania in those times, I relied mostly on my mother and her stories. But of course, to get it right, I had to do some research, even down to what kind of games the kids played, what kind of programs were on the radio they were listening to, that sort of thing. The details are important, and so I did some research. I did a lot more for the second book, taking place in the 20s, before even my parents were born, and in a place where, although I'm familiar with it because I lived near here, there were things that happened on those islands in the 20s, which I won't go into now because I want people to read about it, that I didn't know nearly enough about. So I did quite a lot of research, but I never do the research before I write the book. I answer my own questions as I come to them by doing research. Otherwise, the research drives the writing instead of the other way around.
I'm sure you've heard this final question many times, but what would be your advice for somebody who would like to start writing? Besides what you just said, write about what you know. What other pieces of advice would you give to these people who might be interested? Some of my students, for example, who like to read, who like to write, but who are not sure, how do I go about becoming a writer? What would you say to them?
First of all, I would use the metaphor I used earlier about being a well. I would say, never assume anything about yourself. Never think that you can't do something until you've tried it, because you're full of surprises. There are lots of gifts you haven't unwrapped yet, and so don't think you can't be a writer because you haven't yet started writing. So the first piece of advice is begin. Just, you want to be a writer, write as much as you can, write every day, write lots of different things. And when you feel ready, share your work with other readers and listen to what they say, but listen mostly to yourself. Try not to get that monkey mind I was talking about before. Don't think about how the book's going to end. Don't think about who's going to read it, or whether it's going to win a Newbery or a Pulitzer Prize, or who's going to play what role in the movie version down the road. That's monkey mind. It's going to get in your way of thinking about the best words in the best order, creating complex characters who ring true, working on things like dialogue and figurative language and all of the things that make a book special. So my advice to writers is write. Just write and read. Read as much as you can. Think about the reasons why a book seems good to you, or when a book doesn't seem good to you, doesn't grab you. Think about other forms of art and how they contribute to your vision and what you want to say about the world. And then just say it. Just write it. And don't pay too much attention to anything else.
Author Lauren Wolk, the author of Wolf Hollow, a Newbery Medal Honor Book for 2017. Her new novel, published earlier this year, is Beyond the Bright Sea, and she has joined us here on the written page from Cape Cod. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I really appreciate, Lauren, your time. I absolutely loved your book. I can say that because I've read it, through and through to write that column, and it was an absolute pleasure for me to read it, as it has been a pleasure for me to chat with you here today for this edition of The Written Page.
Thank you so much, Anton. It's been a true pleasure talking to you as well. I so appreciate it, and I hope you liked Beyond the Bright Sea.
I definitely will read it, and I'll let you know what I think. This has been a new episode of The Written Page. This is a podcast that's related to La Página Escrita, my column that I write for the Jordi Sierra Fabre Foundation Journal out of Barcelona, Spain. And right now, it's time to say goodbye. The copyright is 2017 for Anton Garcia Fernandez. It has been recorded live in Martin, Tennessee. Once again, thank you very much, Lauren, and I hope that you keep writing books as good as Wolf Hollow.
Thank you so much, Anton. Goodbye.
Goodbye.